Good afternoon and welcome to this month's Grand Rounds for the UCSF Philip R. Lee Institute for Health Policy Studies. I am delighted to introduce for you today Justin White as our speaker. Justin White is an associate professor of health economics in the UCSF School of Medicine with joint appointments here at IHPS and in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. He studies the role of incentives in promoting healthy behavior informed by research from the field of behavioral economics. Most of his work focuses on chronic disease prevention, notably smoking cessation, both in the US and in low and middle income countries. His work draws on a variety of methodological approaches, including randomized interventional trials and quasi-experimental econometric techniques. Recent and ongoing projects involve evaluations of tobacco and sugar-sweetened beverage taxes, gamification in a smoking cessation smartphone app, and school competitions to prevent smoking. I am delighted to have Justin presenting today, and I want to note that the question and answer is alive in the chat, and that in the chat, then you may ask questions as needed. Or as you desire. We definitely will have room at the end for some lively discussion. So Justin, I hand the microphone over to you to present.
Thank you so much, Joanne, and the committee for having me. It's a pleasure. And let me share my slides. Okay. I am going to be talking today about using incentives to curb tobacco use, subtitle being Behavioral and Policy Insights. I think I flipped that from what it was on the official announcement. And I'm going to talk today about 4 different studies, all having to do with incentives related to smoking in very different contexts, to give you a variety. And the first study is going to be focused on the US and focused on the behavioral biases of smokers. The second study is using workplace wellness incentives for smoking cessation, and that's in workplaces in Thailand. The third study is going to focus on school-based incentives for smoking prevention in Indonesia. And the last study is one that Joanne alluded to, which is smartphone-based gamification for smoking cessation, and that's also in the US. And I think the common thread across all of these studies is that they're using real-world experimental methods and incentive-based interventions that are aimed to try to further our understanding of behavioral economic concepts, as well as tobacco policy. So to give a little bit of background, you can see here a map of smoking prevalence worldwide, and you can see that it's clearly not evenly distributed. That this is showing male adult prevalence, and it's obvious that with the red portions that Asia in particular has very high smoking rates. Whereas in many parts of the Americas, for example, smoking rates are much lower. Here you can see the change in smoking prevalence over time, and this is broken out by the socio-demographic index, which is a composite indicator of development at the country level. And that's been correlated with a number of health outcomes. And you can see that smoking rates have been growing in middle income countries over the last 20 years, and generally declining or staying steady in higher income countries. You can see those sort of discontinuities that occur in the 1990s as well as the mid-2000s, and that's because of China being reclassified as its development status has increased. And so in total, about 73% of smokers live in middle to low socio-demographic index countries. And so then if we look at the percent of DALYs, which is a measure of the disease burden, if you look at the percent of DALYs that are attributable to tobacco. This is the most recent estimates, and this is by sociodemographic index. You can see that the disease burden is also not evenly distributed. In particular, that middle-income countries, high middle to low middle, is where the greatest disease burden is occurring. Low income countries tend to have the least burden, although still substantial. Okay, so when we think about why we should be regulating tobacco or offering smoking cessation interventions, so one of the economic arguments that's made is because of the costs that smoking imposes on non-smokers, as many of you will be familiar. And so these costs are referred to externalities, and are, in the case of smoking, are highly negative in aggregate. So there are health effects that are imposed from secondhand smoke exposure. And I have some stats here that in the US, there was more than 30,000 deaths from heart disease, more than 7,000 lung cancer deaths, 8,000 stroke-related deaths, 1,000 infant deaths each year due to secondhand smoke exposure. Likewise, this tends to be higher among Black non-smokers who incur higher secondhand smoke disease burden than white Americans and Mexican Americans. And in addition to the direct health effects, there are also a number of healthcare costs that are imposed as a result of secondhand smoke exposure. In total, it's almost $2 billion a year as of 2010. And those estimates are from my colleagues here at UCSF, led by Ting Yao. And there are also thought to be some other fiscal externalities in terms of reduced labor productivity, increased reliance on social assistance programs. The estimates there hasn't been as strong of a literature, but those are also to be considered. Now, in addition to these external costs of smoking, there are internal costs. So individuals might make decisions about their smoking that might not be in their own best interest. In so doing, they might impose costs on themselves from this failure to quote unquote optimize, in econ speak, their smoking behavior. And this comes as a result of a number of different elements, but one of the big ones here is addiction. And addiction and the influence that it has on individual behavior, it can also impose a time inconsistency on people's decisions, so that, you know, an individual who says that they want to quit smoking now might have trouble following through on those plans. And this might be manifest as a sort of self-control problem where they can't cut back or stop when they want to. So there have been a few different studies that have tried to estimate what these smoking internalities are, the direct costs through various modeling exercises, and they're thought to be in the range of about $34 to $338 per pack. And it's a wide range because of the varying methods, as well as the number of assumptions that have had to go into this. So we did a study, this is still a working paper form with my colleagues Frank Chlupka and Matt Levy to try to estimate smoking internalities. So in particular, what we did instead of using a typical modeling exercise is that we did a real world randomized controlled trial to try to measure the extent to which individuals make biased decisions about smoking cessation, where biases here are referring to decisions or beliefs that individuals hold that deviate from rational choice. And in part, I want to emphasize that this is as a result or in large part due to the addictive nature of tobacco. And so then, using that RCT, we wanted to assess what these biases implied for smokers' well-being or welfare. So we had a particular economic model in mind that came out of behavioral economics. We used what's called structural estimation to try to estimate what the parameters were for these different biases, which I'll talk about in a moment. And we identified those parameters through a number of different randomizations that occurred as part of the experiment. I'm really just going to give you a little sort of a thumbnail sketch of the study today, because it is fairly complex, but hopefully it'll give you a sense of what our approach was. So then once we had estimated these parameters, we use those to try to calculate, both in terms of utility and money, what the internalities were as a result of people's biased smoking decisions. Okay, so the behavioral biases that we had in mind, they all came out of the behavioral economic literature. The first is called present biased preferences. Another sort of, this can be thought of more colloquially as being imperfect self-control, or I referred to time inconsistent preferences. Those are all sort of synonymous. And the idea is that individuals who are present biased overweight their immediate pleasure from satisfying a craving or avoiding withdrawal symptoms at the expense of the future health and financial benefits that would come with quitting smoking. And there's a lot of evidence that's consistent with this, including the fact that many smokers express a desire to quit, but have trouble following through on those desires. The second bias is related to the first, and it's called naive beliefs or naivete about present bias. And it's the idea that people might lack some awareness of a self-control problem. And so, you know, an individual who has a self-control problem could be aware of that problem, in which case they might take action to try to remedy it. If they know that they're not going to be able to follow through on their quit attempts, then they might try to find ways to bind themselves to quitting. However, if you're not fully aware or not at all aware, depending on the case, then you are going to be less likely to act or act effectively to try to deal with the challenges that addiction and self-control pose. And so that it's really naivete that is particularly troublesome when it comes to measuring people's welfare loss from smoking. Projection bias beliefs is the third bias that I'm going to talk about, and that's where individuals are projecting how they feel now onto how they think they're going to feel into the future. And so this could come in a number of different flavors. One is where it's just sort of moment-to-moment cravings, where people are in a craving state now, not in a craving state in the future, and that, you know, maybe they're going to mispredict how they feel when they are in a craving versus not. What we focused on in this study was addiction states. So when people are addicted, they might fail to predict how their preferences are going to change once they're no longer addicted. So it's that change in addiction. And in particular, they might underestimate the benefits that occur from quitting and their subsequent willingness to abstain. And if they underestimate those benefits, then they might be less likely to come up with a quit plan and to follow through on it. And so in particular, what we do in this study is we try to embed a smoking cessation intervention in our experiment to try to induce this change in addiction, to get people to go from addicted to not addicted. Okay, so in this study, what we did was we had an individual level field experiment, individual level randomization. It was a 3-month study, so fairly short term. We recruited about 400 smokers from 16 different large cities in the US using a web-based panel. And these were adult smokers who had to have smoked at least 20 of the prior 30 days. And we verified their smoking status using a saliva test at baseline before the trial started. And it's important to note that we did not select individuals based on what their plans to quit are. Whereas a typical smoking cessation intervention is going to recruit people who want to quit, we were interested in getting really a broad cross-section of smokers and seeing what the extent to which there were behavioral biases manifested among them. Okay, and so how do we measure real-world biases? So in terms of present bias and naivete, what we did was the first thing we did was we tried to measure people's willingness to pay for future abstinence. So in particular, we asked subjects how much they'd pay for future incentives to abstain. And we did so in a way that tried to incentivize that they would accurately report those preferences. And so I have here on the screen this snapshot of one question that we asked: which would you prefer? Would you rather have $150 if you didn't smoke during a given week of the trial? Or would you rather have $60 regardless of whether you had to abstain from smoking during that week? And so we asked a series of these different choice questions to identify how much they'd pay for those incentives in a given week. And then we randomly selected some participants to actually get one of their actual choices, which made this an incentive compatible choice. In other words, it tried to get people to reveal what their underlying preferences were about how much they would pay for abstinence. And then what we did, the next phase, was that we actually offered real cash incentives for future abstinence. So in various weeks in the trial, we randomly selected weeks, we offered real payments that varied from $10 to $400 to abstain for that week. And then they had to, in order to be paid, they had to report being abstinent, and then they had to have a negative saliva test, which they uploaded in Qualtrics. And so then what we did to actually measure the biases is we compared people's valuations, how much they said they'd pay to be abstinent, how much it actually took them to how much money it took them to abstain. And the difference between those two is a measure of their over-optimism or their present bias and naivete, which again, we fed into our pre-existing economic model. Okay, so then projection bias, what did we do? Well, we had this abstinence smoking cessation intervention that we offered to a random subset of participants. We can call that the treatment group. And then we, during treated weeks, which occurred in month 2, we offered them up to $100 to be abstinent in that week, and then referral to web-based smoking cessation support. So this was designed to create this exogenous increase in abstinence and to decrease their level of addiction. And so then what we could do is that we could measure their valuations for those future abstinence incentives, just what we saw before in those choice questions. We compared those between the treated and control group before versus after the intervention took place. So in other words, before and after this change in addiction state, using our control group as the benchmark, and that is a measure of projection bias. Okay, so just jumping ahead to our structural estimates. I'm not going to show you sort of the nitty-gritty findings that we had, but what we found was that present bias was present in 100% of our sample. So every single smoker was overly optimistic about their ability to quit. And in other words, their valuation of how much they thought it would take them to quit was higher than what it actually took them to quit. And a large majority, 92%, were naive about the extent of their present bias. So we also measured actually 2 forms of projection bias. So first, prior to the cessation intervention, we looked at, did they mispredict the value of being abstinent? And this is the way that projection bias has been measured in past studies. And what we find there is that 77% of participants showed signs of projection bias. But we also had end of study predictions that we could use to see if after the fact, did participants realize that the intervention had increased their ability to quit and their welfare? So, before the fact, people didn't expect that the intervention would help them. After the fact, it turns out 81% didn't realize that the intervention had actually had a positive effect on them. And so in other words, that this means that beforehand, people don't realize that the intervention is going to have an effect, and afterwards, they think that it actually had a negative effect and made things worse. And so this gets at the point that delivering interventions might not be enough, but we might need to somehow communicate the value of interventions to their beneficiaries, in part because of these behavioral biases. Okay, so then we also measured the cost of these smoking internalities. So from the perspective of a present bias smoker, there was a strong preference for them to continue smoking. Based on their own stated preferences in the study, it was beneficial for them to continue smoking as present bias smokers. However, once we correct for present bias, smoking was about welfare neutral, and there wouldn't be any benefit in terms of welfare from continuing to smoke. And then once we correct for present bias and projection bias, smoking induced a large private welfare loss of about $414 per week. So every week that people smoke, they're incurring a loss of about $400. And then that is equivalent to about $80 per pack. So it's sort of like in the middle of the range that I mentioned earlier, related to the modeling results that other people have found. And so present bias decreased the value of quitting by about $2,600, projection bias by about $400. And so present bias is really the bigger bias here, but projection bias is also playing a big role. And we also did some calculations that showed that if there were going to be a sales ban on cigarettes, it would increase smokers' welfare by about $350 per week. Okay, so what this shows is that smokers are suffering from a number of different biases, and that leads to potential interventions that we can think about. And here I'm going to talk about incentives as one potential solution to these behavioral issues that many smokers face. And so personal incentives can help to overcome some of these behavioral biases by countering present bias, for example, if the rewards from those incentives are offered immediately. That can counter those sort of immediate withdrawal symptoms or cravings that people have. And more generally, it's going to force people to recalibrate the cost-benefit trade-off of quitting, even if a person might hold naive beliefs or projection bias beliefs about what the value of quitting is. And it's going to provide a salient benefit to people. Incentives are a way to call attention to people saying that this is something that they should be focusing on now. And it also is going to signal norms that are in favor of promoting health. To say that, whether it's the policymaker or the researcher, think that this is of value, it's important to quit smoking, and incentives sort of embed that value even above the actual monetary value that the incentives might bring. Okay, so what are the evidence for incentives for smoking cessation? So there have been a number of different trials that have looked at incentives for smoking cessation. The latest Cochrane meta-analysis shows that there's a high certainty evidence that incentives do improve smoking cessation rates. The risk ratio is about 2.4, so fairly large. And there's also been head-to-head tests of incentives versus other types of interventions. One notable study by Scott Halpern found that incentives are more effective than e-cigarettes alone or pharmacotherapy alone for smoking cessation. There's also a number of data points that can be drawn from real-world evidence that supports the idea that incentives can be effective. The one that probably comes first to mind is tobacco taxation. Taxation is essentially a form of incentive by altering the price of tobacco products. And there's a large literature that's developed within health economics showing that tobacco taxes are an effective tool for changing smoking behavior. Other forms of evidence come from insurance premium surcharges. As a result of the Affordable Care Act, smokers can now be charged higher premiums. And actually the evidence there is sort of more lukewarm, where the studies do not find that higher premium surcharges result in increases in smoking cessation. However, the other forms of evidence, including contingency management, do find that incentives are effective. Contingency management is a form of incentives that have long been used within psychology and psychiatry, where very small incentives are used to try to change the behavior, in particular for people who use substances. And the latest meta-analysis there shows that contingency management approaches are also effective. And there's also been tests by the Medicaid program. CMS had a pilot program in, I think it was 10 states, where they offered incentives for using smoking cessation services. And that was also, the study by Whitman also found that those pilot programs were effective. There are some important gaps here. So one is in terms of low and middle income countries, there's been very little evidence. And also in terms of different incentive designs, there's been limited evidence on the effects that basically in terms of, should we offer large incentives versus small ones? Should we offer penalties versus rewards, et cetera? And that was the focus of those two gaps were the focus of this study in Thailand on workplace incentives. So this was called the SMILE trial. It was a cluster randomized controlled trial in the metro area of Bangkok. It was a 9-arm trial where we tried multiple different incentive designs. It was a 3-month intervention where we had follow up with urine testing at 3, 6, and 12 months, and the 12 months was our primary endpoint. And it was really more of a pragmatic trial than an efficacy trial because we tried to offer it in pretty realistic conditions. Tobacco treatment in low-income settings is often lacking, in part because of lack of medical professionals, oftentimes limited access to medical facilities in a number of low-income settings, and the cost and availability of medications, especially when they're not covered by the government. And so we thought that there was an opportunity for these low-cost behavioral interventions like incentives to try to increase smoking cessation. So the context here in Thailand was that Thailand is known for having fairly comprehensive tobacco control policies. There's fairly high demand for quitting there. A lot of smokers express a desire to quit, but there was certainly at the time fairly low use of smoking cessation aids, even when they were available and paid for. So at study launch, the smoking prevalence in Thailand was about 20% overall, and about 34% among the factory workers that we targeted in this study. Here are the 9 different randomization groups, as well as the different intervention components. Usual care was where we offer brief counseling as well as a text messaging program. There were deposits, which I'll describe in a moment, a small individual bonus, a large individual bonus, and some people were assigned a teammate as well. So those intervention components, so we offered, had a trained nurse who showed up at enrollment meetings at each worksite to deliver one-time counseling. We also offered individual bonus that was contingent on quitting at 3 months. We tried 2 different levels, a $20 bonus and a $40 bonus. In other arms, individuals were randomly assigned a teammate from the same work site, the same work shift, and who had the same native language. Otherwise, it could be randomly assigned from anyone at that work site, and these were large work sites, so in some cases there wasn't a lot of social interaction. And then there was a team bonus where if an individual and their teammate both quit at 3 months, they each receive $40 for abstinence. And then finally, we tried a deposit-based intervention where we offer people a personal deposit box, which you can see here, which was not open, couldn't be opened except if they destroyed the box. And there was a $5 collateral that they gave us, which was returned to them if they returned the box intact. And then there was a small minimum contribution, and then individuals could make additional contributions as they saw fit. So this was that, and then all deposits were then contingent on being abstinent at 3 months. And this is a form of commitment contract, which comes out of the behavioral economics literature, which is designed specifically to promote self-control and to overcome present bias that we discussed earlier. Okay, so our questions here was, did the intervention increase program acceptance or take up? And we anticipate that it would increase take up among the bonus intervention because the bonus would attract individuals. We thought it would decrease take up for the deposit-based interventions where individuals might be reluctant to try to put their own money at risk. And then secondly, we wanted to know if this increased smoking abstinence at 12 months. And we had some more hypotheses here that we thought that the bonus would be increased efficacy versus a control group. And we thought it would be a dose response relationship where the bigger incentive would have a bigger response. We thought that the deposits would increase smoke efficacy relative to the control. And we thought it would be increased efficacy versus the individual bonus. And that's in part because we thought that due to loss aversion, people value their own money and the potential to lose money more than they might value a similar sized gain. And that also comes out of Scott Halpern's trial that I referred to earlier. And then finally, we thought that the team bonus would be more effective than a similar sized individual bonus because of the peer pressure and the social support that could be delivered in the pair-based intervention. Okay, so we screened, it was 101 work sites, about 12 work sites per group. We screened about 8,000 smokers and enrolled about 4,000. And of those 4,200, 2,400 ended up enrolling or accepting their assigned program. So jumping right to the results, our program acceptance was observed to be quite high across all groups. You can see that this is the percent who accepted the program that they were offered. And you can see that across all interventions, it was nearly a 50% or more program take-up. And there was not observed to be very large differences across randomization groups. When we see, you can see when we break it out by intervention component, that when we look at deposits versus no deposits, there was a small decrease in take-up or program acceptance of about 8 percentage points. But this is relatively minor, and especially when compared to prior studies. So then jumping to our primary outcome, we can see, looking at the smoking abstinence at 12 months, that abstinence did increase with bonus size as predicted. And so comparing the $40 group to the $0 group, it was about a 230% increase, going from about 10 percentage point, 10% quit rate in the control group to about 23% in the $40 individual bonus group. Abstinence decreased for the team bonus versus the same size individual bonus. This is the opposite of what we had predicted, and we hypothesized that it might have to do with the limited social interaction that occurred in that group, and the fact that we weren't using pre-existing social networks. Abstinence did not increase for the deposit group versus the control group, and it was actually lower for the deposit group versus the large individual bonus group. Which is not what we predicted either. And we did not observe interaction effects when in the group that combined a bonus with a deposit. So those were not more effective than either of those interventions alone. So, and then when we compare to by intervention component, you can see the decrease for the team versus individual, and the increase for the $40 bonus versus the $20 and $0 bonus. Okay, so our conclusions in the study were that there was high take-up across all arms, including for the deposit arm, the commitment contract, which to us indicated that there was really high demand for any smoking cessation support in this setting. The program effects were largest for the large individual bonus, and the deposits were not effective, neither were the team incentives. And I didn't show this, but relapse after the intervention ended at 3 months was really low. And so this effect did sustain up to a year after the intervention. And another thing was that implementation factors appeared to be quite important. And I'll show you that one example of that here. So this is looking at each of these circles shows a different work site. And you can see that the proportion that took up the intervention varied quite substantially across work site. And that gets to the fact that the health officers at each work site played a big role in terms of recruitment, and that those sort of implementation factors can play a big role in driving the success of different programs. So to move to the second study that I'm going to talk about, this is a smoking prevention study in Indonesia. And it's using non-monetary incentives as opposed to monetary incentives that we just looked at in Thailand. So this is a school prevention program, which we thought of as an alternative tobacco control strategy. And I'll tell you why we pursued an alternative strategy in a moment. And we targeted middle school students who were about 13 to 14 years old. And in particular, these were boys because female smoking prevalence is quite low in Indonesia. And we targeted their middle school students because it just preceded the timing of typical smoking initiation in Indonesia. Some of the features of the intervention here were that it was quite low cost because being non-monetary. And we thought that this might be helpful in terms of trying to scale this intervention beyond just this trial. We combined both a reward and a penalty intervention that I'll describe in a moment. And here we also engaged existing social networks to try to promote smoking behavior change. So in particular, we used parents, teachers, as well as peer students to try to all influence the smoking behavior that was occurring in our targeted students. And So the context here in Indonesia, so Indonesia has among the highest rates of male smoking prevalence in the world. It's about 70% of men smoke, whereas among women, it's somewhere around, I think, 5%. So very high rates of male smoking prevalence. Deaths in Indonesia due to smoking are about 17%. 17% overall, and about 25% of male deaths are tied to or attributable to tobacco use. Adolescent smoking is quite high, and there was a 17% increase in the number of young adult smokers in Indonesia over the last few decades. So one reason why tobacco use is so high in Indonesia is that it's a tobacco producing country. One of the leading tobacco producing countries in the world, and that's created some national political resistance to regulating tobacco. One reason being that it's a major industry, and so there's a lot of political clout for the tobacco industry in Indonesia. And I think this political resistance to tobacco control regulations is the fact that Indonesia is one of only a handful of countries worldwide that has yet to adopt or ratify the WHO's Tobacco Control Treaty, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. And so given that national regulation has been quite difficult, I think it raises an opportunity here for subnational efforts to try to experiment and try to curb smoking rates. And that was really the rationale behind why we focused on a local school-based intervention. So some of our contributions here were that we were focusing on adolescents as opposed to adults, where incentives hadn't been commonly employed. And adolescents, it's a period of their life when their brain is still developing, when their ability to plan and show impulse control is still developing. And so that might mean that incentives might be especially promising. And adolescence is also the period when lifelong habits are forming. And so if you can cut off those habits early on, maybe there could be long-lasting benefits. I already mentioned that this is a non-monetary as opposed to a monetary incentive. It means that it could not only might be scalable, but also sustainable. And we found in our conversations with the local government that we partnered with, that it was more culturally acceptable within a school setting. We tried social incentive schemes as opposed to just a purely personal one that I also alluded to, and I'll talk more about in a minute. And this was a middle-income country where smoking prevention incentives have not really been tried, although there has been efforts in Europe with the smoke-free class competition program, which our intervention was in part modeled off of. Okay, so this was a 3-arm cluster randomized controlled trial of 72 schools. This was located in central Java in the Yogyakarta province. And we assigned half of the sample to the control group. The other half was split between 2 different sub-treatments. And in total, we had about 2,800 individuals, students who were enrolled in this trial. All groups received anti-tobacco information. One group both treatment groups had a commitment pledge that they signed, and one of the treated groups also had a school competition. And I'll talk about those now. So the commitment pledge, you can see the certificate here. We asked individuals to sign a pledge that they would not use tobacco. We also had them sign a class pledge that was split amongst everybody. We think of this as a partial commitment contract. It's partial in the sense that there's a power dynamic in the classroom that children can't fully opt in voluntarily. And so we think of this as there would be some pre-commitment involved in this pledge, but there's also a little bit of paternalism involved as well. So parents also were asked to sign a similar pledge to their children and a pledge to monitor their children's smoking behavior. And then we collected biweekly reports from the students and their teachers about who had been observed smoking in the classroom. And so students, these were anonymous reports where individuals would also report the smoking status of their peers, not just of themselves. And so that happened during a 5-month intervention period. And then students who failed to abstain were given demerits in the school classroom. And then after the third and subsequent infraction, their parents were notified that they'd been caught smoking or been found to be smoking. So then in the other treatment group, there was the same commitment pledge intervention, as well as a school competition where schools competed to have the highest tobacco abstinence rate. And here we provided biweekly ratings, basically, of which schools rated in the top 10. And we issued congratulatory reports. And that was, again, based on the biweekly feedback that we received. And then the top 10 schools were given a plaque and had a presentation by the local government at 5 months. And we thought of this as a team incentive approach that tried to emphasize group identity or school spirit in terms of motivating individuals not to smoke. So jumping right to our results. So we followed up students at 3 months, which was midway through the intervention. That was at wave 2, and then again at 8 months, which was the start of the following school year. So at each follow-up, we used urine testing to assess smoking status. And here I'm showing the effects of the program on our main outcome, which was point prevalent smoking abstinence. So in other words, smoking, whether they had smoked at all in the prior 7 days. And what I'm showing here is I'm pooling students across both incentive groups. And so what we see when the pooled effects of treatment was that there was about a 6% increase in abstinence. And that holds across a few different ways we looked at that. And the effect was sustained into the next school year. So you can see that at wave 3, this effect persisted. So even beyond the summer session. Okay, so now let me show you the effects by each of the different incentive groups. Again, looking at tobacco abstinence over the prior 7 days. And so what you can see here is that in the pledge, we see the same sized increase in smoking abstinence relative to the control group. And this is in the post period relative to the pre-period. Whereas in the school competition, there's no difference. And so there was no additional effect of the school competition on top of the individual pledge. So in other words, the entire effect is operating through the pledge. So we tried to explore the role of several different potential mechanisms that might explain our findings. I don't have time to go into a lot of the details, but just to summarize, we found that in general, peers did appear to influence each other in aggregate. And we found some evidence consistent with the fact that there was changing perceived social norms. So the social norms around the perceived acceptance of smoking in the classroom. And we also found that the program effects were largest for participants, students that had low self-control, which might suggest that the intervention might be especially effective for present bias students to follow through on their plans to abstain. So wrapping up, we found that this non-monetary penalty was effective for smoking prevention. And it might be especially effective for adolescents who face limited social pressure, self-control, and peer pressure. We engaged parents, teachers, and peers to add accountability. We did find that this effect persisted beyond the end of our monitoring. And we found that it was a fairly low-cost approach. We did a back-of-the-envelope cost-benefit analysis and found that it was fairly low cost, about $220 per smoker averted, and the benefit to cost ratio was about 5 to 18. So this was a pretty highly beneficial program. So the last study I'm going to talk about in the remaining few minutes is one based on gamification for smoking cessation in a smartphone app. And this is an ongoing study, so I'm just really going to describe the setup and rationale behind why we're undertaking this. So smokers are increasingly seeking help online and through smartphone apps in order to quit smoking. Some of the challenges, though, are that apps have fairly low levels of adherence to treatment guidelines, and there's really high dropout rates for mobile health apps in general, including for smoking cessation apps. Gamification is a tool that's designed to increase user engagement, including in mobile health settings, and it uses non-monetary rewards to try to transform non-game contexts, such as quitting smoking, into being fun or a challenge. And many of you would be familiar with gamification through things like earning badges in mobile health apps in exchange for completing some milestone, for example. And a lot of mobile health apps do currently employ some form of gamification. The majority of the top apps do. There's been growing evidence that gamification can be helpful for physical activity and weight loss apps, but there's really not much known about how successful it can be for smoking cessation. So what we did here was we partnered with Smoke Free, which is a leading smart smoking cessation app, to try to embed a particular form of gamification. And Smoke Free has been found to be, it adheres to the United Kingdom's smoking cessation guidelines. It's based in the UK. And there have been multiple RCTs that show that Smoke Free is effective for increasing abstinence. And so our rationale here, our conceptual model, just briefly simplified, is that we had this game which we thought would increase user engagement in Smoke Free. And that engagement would increase retention in the app, as well as increase adherence to the program, in particular because we were incentivizing adherence to the program, and that in turn would eventually increase smoking cessation. So what we did was we developed the Inner Dragon program, where users raise a dragon, so a digital pet of sorts, that evolves along with their quit attempt. And this is giving visual feedback that has endogenous value. In other words, that it's tied closely to the user's motivation to quit smoking. And that idea of an endogenous value is very closely tied to self-determination theory from psychology, which says that intrinsic motivation can oftentimes be more effective than extrinsic reinforcement. So we were trying to really try to call attention to individuals' intrinsic motivation to quit. So we also used a digital pet to try to create a sense of bonding and accomplishment, and to reinforce this identity as a new you or as a non-smoker. So users were earning virtual points for using core app features. That's the program adherence function. So core app features like reading tips within the app were incentivized. And then they were also given virtual points for using the game module. And then these points unlock gifts to accessorize or customize their dragon. So the best way to show you what this is to really, just quickly show you a promo, a minute-long promo of our idea. Okay, so that's our promo. Let me try to go back. So what we are doing here right now are underway. We have a pilot trial, just to wrap up a couple more slides. We have a 2-arm pilot randomized controlled trial where we're testing the core smoke-free app versus one that has this Inner Dragon gamification approach, where our primary outcomes here are focused on measures of user engagement. We're trying to get about 500 users. And I think that it's an outstanding question, really, whether this sort of approach might be successful. I think a lot of the potential lies in its ability to reach large number of individuals. And one indication of that is that there have been attempts in places with Germany leading the effort to try to have digital therapeutics like the one that we're proposing that can be prescribed by clinicians, where they can actually say, you should use this program, and it has evidence behind it. And Smoke Free actually has a pending application to use its version of the app that includes Inner Dragon that could then be prescribed to users. And so I think that there's also a lot of rich user data that can be brought to bear here to understand what drives behavior and to build more effective smoking cessation tools. So just wrapping up, I think personal incentives can influence smoking behavior across a variety of settings. I've talked about some varied ones today. They can be targeted toward high priority groups. They can potentially have wide reach with somewhat limited overhead, as opposed to clinical treatment programs for smoking cessation have been found to be very effective, but can sometimes be higher cost and can sometimes require a lot more, many more resources in terms of personnel, for example. The designs can be tailored to address specific decision errors that might be afflicting smokers. I think that tobacco taxation can also serve a similar but perhaps coarser role in terms of helping individuals to quit smoking. Social incentives can backfire, and I've talked in two different contexts about how that's the case. And I think that just gets at the idea that incentive designs need to be well thought out and carefully tested in order to really understand which ones might be most effective. And so while monetary incentives are, pun intended, a known quantity, I think that we can also think about non-monetary incentives as holding potential as lower cost alternatives. And in the future, I'd like to do more in terms of directly testing head-to-head monetary versus non-monetary incentives. I want to acknowledge my funding from NIH as well as other funders and my many collaborators, and I will end it there.
Thank you a ton, Justin. So anybody who wants to ask questions, please feel free to put it in the question and answer box that is at the bottom of your screen. We do have a question in already. This is from Rob Lustig, who many of us know is an IHPS affiliate, UCSF faculty member. And he noted that there was a paper that just came out in PLOS One on the Seattle soda tax, which you probably saw, that showed that while soda consumption declined, beer consumption increased, suggesting addiction transfer. So he wonders, while incentives might be able to reduce tobacco consumption, might they also be transferring that tobacco consumption essentially to some other hedonic substance such as soda? And is this an avenue for important future research?
Yeah, it's definitely an important question. I think that was actually has come up already within our gamification project, for example, where individuals, there's a concern, video games can also be addictive potentially, and that, maybe by reinforcing that, by offering them some sort of video game, that could sort of be a substitution. We felt like in our situation that, given the amount of people are going to be using that intervention, that's pretty low risk. I think more generally, this could be a concern. I've been part of a sugar sweetened beverage tax evaluation that, we have a paper under review where we looked at a number of different substitution that people might have for the taxes in terms of substituting to other types of sweets, for example. We don't find evidence of that. There have been other studies, Rob, that I can point you to that have also not found that there's much of an increase in consuming candy or other sweets as a result of sugar sweetened beverage taxes. I think it is always worth considering I think especially in situations where people can substitute one behavior for another, I think it's important to recognize that that's a risk. And I absolutely encourage that's those sorts of analyses to be studied and investigated.
Great, thank you. We got another question from an anonymous attendee that notes that prior research in the US has shown that an economic incentive for completing a 9-month to 1-year abstinence period seemed to have the best response around $800. And the question is, were there any corresponding calculations with the choice of incentives in any of the studies you've discussed?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I believe that's referring to one of Scott Halpern's studies that used $800. I don't know of any studies that do a formal optimal calculation, sort of like say, in principle, if you offered a number of different incentive amounts, you could determine which one produces the optimal effect in terms of, as a result of some sort of cost effectiveness calculation. In Thailand, what we did was we did some pre-testing where we did some surveys to try to understand how much people stated that it would take them to change their behavior. I think, I would love to see more evidence to understand exactly how much it would take, though, across different settings. And I imagine that there is a lot of variation, from individual to individual in terms of how much would take. And presumably that would be associated with what their income is, what their level of addiction is, et cetera.
All right, Sarah Garrett, who is our current Phil Lee postdoctoral fellow at IHPS, noted that it's a very creative set of studies, and I think a lot of us really admire your work in this area, Justin. She asks, can you share any lessons learned from collaborating with cities, school districts, and so on that might be useful to colleagues that are looking to launch intervention studies with community partners?
So I've found, which hasn't always been the case in all of my studies, is that it's useful to come in with an open mind in terms of a particular intervention that you want to test. I think that oftentimes you need to get community feedback in terms of what types of interventions are going to be acceptable in it. And so I know, for example, I mentioned in the Indonesia study that the local education and health departments were not comfortable with using any sort of monetary approach within school because they felt like that was counter to their mission and could have potentially adverse consequences. And so it took, a series of conversations with them to understand what might work best. And I think just getting a broad set of feedback about, ideally doing surveys or doing some sort of qualitative research up front to get a sense of what people want, what people need is really important. And I think I am absolutely a big fan of that sort of mixed methods approach, pre-testing before launching any sort of RCT.
Great. We have just a couple minutes left, and a really good question just came in. This one also from an anonymous attendee. In your opinion, do you think gamification stacks up to the mindfulness and craving control techniques? And are there generational factors that might contribute to success rates?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had on the slide, but didn't mention in our gamification study, just starting with the generational point, that we have a stratified randomization design where we are recruiting older smokers, specifically because we want to understand whether they would be as receptive to a video game-like approach. They might be less familiar with video games or sort of less open to it. And so in that study, we will specifically be looking at what the differences are by age. I think that in terms of alternate approaches, including mindfulness, I haven't seen any evidence that does a head-to-head comparison. I don't think that there's anything that makes them, that means that they couldn't be complementary even, sort of offered within the same app. And I know that there are mindfulness apps that also use gamification approaches, for example. So I think that it's a rich area for study, and I hope that there becomes a more robust evidence base to try to understand which of these approaches might be most valuable.
Well, thank you so much for presenting this set of studies. I was glad that you said that you were going to present multiple things, because I know that you have such a rich body of work across tobacco and sugar, and this work is applicable, surely has lessons for many other different areas of health behavior. So thank you very much for being with us, Justin, and thank you to those of you who joined our webinar today. We'll be back in March for the third week of March for grand rounds as usual. So look for announcements for that soon. Have a great day.
Thanks so much.